Okay, so evening everyone. Thank you for taking the time to come along to this insight event for the MSci in Pharmaceutical Biosciences. I'm Peter McPherson. I'm one of the senior lecturers in the School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Science, and I also act as course director for this program. So I'm joined this evening by a number of colleagues who will be around to be able to answer any of your questions that you might have as we go through this presentation. So feel free to put those into the chat window, and the most appropriate person will answer those. So what we hope to cover this evening is just a bit of context about how pharmaceutical biosciences fits within the overall UK and Ireland economy, thinking about the specifics of the programme itself, and then of course the very important admissions information, and then finally an opportunity for some questions at the end. So if we want to think about what we mean when we say pharmaceutical bioscience, as opposed to pharmaceutical science, which is another version of the program that is offered elsewhere, the main emphasis for us is that we want the graduates of this program to be as employable as possible. And so therefore, what we want is for our students to have exposure to the pharmaceutical science, which is important, but also the life sciences in general. And the reason for that is because in Northern Ireland, whilst we do have a large pharmaceutical industry, we also have a very large life sciences industry. And so by training our students in such a way that they can go down either of those two routes, it means that you are much more employable when you graduate. So the biosciences program, however, despite the fact that it might have that life sciences leaning towards it, is very, very, very strongly based on a fundamental knowledge of chemistry. And we'll see a little bit later on when we look at the entry requirements that we ask for chemistry to be one of those essential subjects that we have. One of the other things that we see that when we look across all the different programs that are available is that very often there are programs like pharmaceutical chemistry or medicinal chemistry that some universities offer. And at Ulster, we do include those topics within our program, but they're not discrete modules in their own right. And the reason for that is because we take a holistic approach in this program. So we mix the chemistry along with the biology, along with the pharmaceutical sciences and pharmaceutics and all of these different areas to make you a little bit more well-rounded and to give everybody a chance to see how connections are made between the different aspects of science. Now, just to give a slight scientific example of that, some of you will perhaps know a bit about the drug thalidomide. So this was a drug that when it was first synthesized was really used to help manage morning sickness during the first trimester of pregnancy. And one of the things that was discovered not long after its first use is that some people who had been taking thalidomide, their children ended up having some birth defects, but not everybody did. And the reason for that is because when you make thalidomide synthetically in a chemistry laboratory with lots of glassware and all of the things that you might think would happen in a chemistry laboratory, you actually get two different types of the drug made. They're called isomers, which those of you who do some chemistry should know something about. And one of these isomers is useful. It's the thing that helps prevent morning sickness, but the other isomer is not. It's the one that can cause the birth defects. And so the problem that we have when we do drug synthesis using purely chemical techniques is it's very difficult to control which isomer you get formed. Is it the R isomer or the S isomer? And so as science has progressed, we have learned that actually there's a much better way of synthesizing drugs like thalidomide that exist in these two different shapes. And that is to use living cells to synthesize these drugs. And that's kind of what we mean when we say biotechnology or biopharmaceutical science, because you're taking living cells that are able to perform all of these chemical reactions inside them and then use those to make the drugs, which we can then extract and then turn into the tablets or the injectables or the creams or whatever dosage form it is that we want to use. Another good example of why the bioscience is important in pharmaceutical sciences is that there are a large number of drugs which are now generally commonly referred to as biologics. And these are drugs which are based on monoclonal antibody technology. So these are very often used for autoimmune conditions because autoimmune conditions are based on the immune system, and of course antibodies are part of the immune system. So a very common example of that, and one that's used quite a bit, is infliximab. Infliximab is one of these drugs that is used to treat conditions that have a very strong inflammatory component. So things like Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, and so on. And by understanding the biology as much as you understand the chemistry, it then means that our graduates are able to deal with drugs like infliximab and how they're made and how they're purified and all of those complex steps, as well as the drugs that are a little bit more based on pure chemistry. And so for those reasons, that is why we as a university have decided to combine the more traditional pharmaceutical sciences and chemistry with the bioscience, because we believe it gives our graduates the best chance of getting into a really good career with really good salary and all of the benefits that you would expect with that. So that in mind, what about the industry as a whole across we'll treat the island of Ireland as a whole at this stage. Well, when we look at this map, now this map is a few years old, but things haven't changed drastically. We see that the vast majority of the pharma and life sciences companies are in the very south of Ireland, around Cork, and that's simply because Cork is a very large city. It has a very large harbour. There's a lot of import and export happens there, so that's why there's a big locus of activity there. But if we look at other areas, so if you look over to the west and sort of the region that would be traditionally referred to as Connacht, we see that again there's a large number of pharmaceutical industries there. And in the north of the island, actually, given the size and the population that we have, there is also a large number of these life sciences and pharmaceutical industries that are present. Most of you probably will have heard of companies like Almac and Randox and Norbrook and perhaps even Teva. Some of the rest of you may have had family members or people that you know who work in these companies, or perhaps in companies that are a little bit like them. Something that is also worth bearing in mind is that our graduates, yes, you're trained in the pharmaceutical sciences and the life sciences, but that doesn't mean there aren't other careers that you can go into. So a classic example of this would be the civil service. To get into the civil service, you do have to sit the civil service entry exam, but the benefits and the salary and the pensions and all of those things that are associated with a career in the civil service are excellent. So AFBI, which is the one of the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute, are part of the civil service, and they would employ a large number of life science graduates. Health service, all hospitals have laboratories of varying degrees in them, and they also employ scientists at different levels, biomedical scientists, clinical scientists, and so on, to perform the analyses. And then, of course, there are other careers like teaching. Some people will do graduate conversion course and go into law, and some people will go into graduate entry medicine as well, which of course we have at our London Derry campus, where you can complete a medical degree in 4 years. So if you are doing a degree in pharmaceutical biosciences, it is not just strictly a case So the MSci itself then, what are some of the things that we cover? Well, in the first year, it's a fairly general year. At the minute, our first year MSci students are largely combined with our first year pharmacy, our MPharm students, and you will cover the basics of chemistry, of biology, anatomy, physiology, some study skills, some mathematics, some statistics, all the foundations really that you need in order to be successful and progress through the other years of study. In the second year, then we deal with some slightly more complex areas. So physical pharmacy, which is to do with formulation of medicines. There's some analytical chemistry in there. There's some hematology. There's various other modules which relate to the life sciences aspect of the program. Importantly, in second year, that is where you encounter the first of your 2 work placements. The first one is Teva, which happens around about this time every year. And then the second semester, there's a placement with Almac. And those placements are really just designed to give you a little bit of exposure to what the real science industry is like. and also to start making those contacts with people that may eventually end up being your employers. In the third year, you are continuing your study of even more advanced material, and you also complete an individual research project. And that is what, in various institutions, some people call an honours project, some people call it a dissertation, but it's a program where you undertake a period of research that is novel. You do that in some of our laboratories, and at the end of it, you write it up as a fairly substantial report that we normally refer to as a dissertation. Also in year three, there are a few more placements which you undertake. Norbrook, which are exclusively veterinary medicines in Uri. Randox, which are not pharmaceutical, they're a life sciences company. And Nicobrand, which is just outside Coleraine, they are involved in nicotine replacement products. Now, at the end of year three, occasionally some people decide that they would like to exit with the BSc ONS, and that is, of course, entirely possible. Those tend to be people who maybe want to go down one of those graduate entry routes afterwards, and the BSc is sufficient for their needs. However, generally speaking, we would encourage most of our students to continue into the fourth year, and the fourth year has a very substantial work placement in it. It's 24 weeks, well, a minimum of 24 weeks, and you undertake that in a relevant industry. It could be in Northern Ireland, it could be in the island of Ireland, it could technically be anywhere in the world that you can find this placement. And alongside that, you complete some online modules, and these are delivered by university staff that you access through our virtual learning environment. And there are, of course, the usual assignments and coursework and tests and so on that you complete. And then, if all goes according to plan, you've passed everything you need to pass, then you will graduate usually in June or July after completion of your fourth year with a Master in Science in Pharmaceutical Bioscience. And after that, then it is a case of perhaps maybe returning to Ulster for postgraduate study as a PhD researcher, or you may go directly into employment, or you may go down one of those various other postgraduate routes, PGCE for teaching, whatever it is that you've decided is best for you. So one of the things, of course, that we are obliged to say is that our courses are constantly evolving. We have to change the content of our course to reflect what industry are telling us that they need more of. And so sometimes when you start off in the first year of the degree, the modules that you would end up perhaps doing in third or fourth year might change ever so slightly. And that's just the natural order of things in a university program. So those changes, of course, you'll always be told about well in advance. And if any of them have significant impacts, we seek to minimize that. The other thing just to keep in mind is that when you are starting any science program, there is a little bit more risk associated with being in laboratories and so on. So we therefore ask that students purchase their own laboratory coat, white coat, and safety glasses as a minimum. So those can be bought in university stores, or you can just buy them yourself online, Amazon, etc. Other retailers are there, and make sure that you have those and bring those with you. There may be other incidental expenses that you'll incur throughout the program. So for example, if you have to travel to one of your work placements, you might need to pay for train, bus fare, or if you drive, car parking. There will always be those small incidental expenses as well. Now, one of the questions that we often get asked is, what's the difference between the MSci and the MPharm? In some respects, there aren't many differences, but in other respects, there are huge differences. They are both four-year integrated master's degrees. So they're both the same sort of academic level, if you think of it in those terms. They both have a degree of placement in them. The MSci placement I've talked about, the MPharm placement is a slightly different beast. But the big difference between the two programs is that for the MSci, the focus is very much on the science of pharmacy and of pharmaceutical sciences. Whereas on the MPharm, the focus is more on the clinical use and developing clinical skills and interacting with patients. So very often the two programs do have elements that appear similar, but actually when it comes down to the business of the job at hand, they are distinctly different. If you are very much a people person and you have those skills and you enjoy that, the MPharm is certainly an option. But if you're somebody who prefers more to be in the lab environment, perhaps a little bit in the background, maybe don't like working with members of the public so much, then the MSci is a much better fit. So our MSci in Pharmaceutical Bioscience is based on the Coleraine campus of Ulster University. This is a true campus, as in it's a standalone environment. Our halls of residence are on campus. All of the teaching facilities are on campus. The main building has a shop, there's a cafeteria, all of the things that you would expect to be on a campus-based institution. There's also a very, very good sports centre. And the campus itself is only about, well, 10 to 15 minutes walk from Coleraine Town Centre, depending on how quickly you walk. So it's very easy to get into the town centre, to get to the local bus and rail stations if you want to travel back home or wherever it is that you need to go. But on the other side of it is that the campus is very, very close to some of our more popular tourist towns, Portstewart, Portrush, and very often a lot of our students, certainly in their second, third, and sometimes fourth year, will end up living in either Portrush or Portstewart. They're within easy commuting distance of the university campus, and a lot of students will end up sharing houses with people that they've become friends with. So it's a very friendly campus, very friendly atmosphere. And if you're somebody who enjoys sort of coastal life, maybe if you're a surfer or a waterboarder or something like that, then there are all of those facilities that are available locally. So just a little bit then about the school. So we as a school sit within the Faculty of Life and Health Sciences. That is divided into a number of smaller schools. And our school, Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Science, offers now 3 undergraduate programs. The MPharm, which is for those people who wish to become pharmacists. The MSci, which is a program, of course, we're talking about. And now there is a 3rd new undergraduate program, which is a BSc in veterinary nursing, obviously for people who wish to become a veterinary nurse. At the postgraduate level, we have a few different programs. We have advanced diplomas, MSc, PhD programs, postgraduate certificates, which some of those are available to people from a science background. Some of them are only available to people who are registered pharmacists and are wanting to upskill. All of our staff within the school are what we refer to as being research active. So that means that they are constantly updating their own skills and knowledge by participating in research. Some staff, of course, will be a little bit more clinically focused, and then the remainder will be scientific focus, and some sit somewhere between the two. We're very well resourced. We have good teaching labs, we have good research labs, we have facilities that are certainly of industry standards. So we have an NMR facility, we have a dedicated pharmaceutics lab, a dedicated aseptic suite, and so on. And something which is becoming increasingly important in the brave new world that we find ourselves in is being able to use artificial intelligence and modeling and all of these advanced techniques that involve processing of data. And in order to be able to do that effectively, you need access to supercomputer facilities. So Ulster University subscribes to the Northern Ireland High Performance Computing Network, which is called Kelvin 2. It's ourselves and Queen's University that help pay for that. And members of staff and certain undergraduate students have access to that supercomputer network to run programs that are very computationally intensive. As a school, we perform very, very well in comparison to others across the UK. Second in pharmacology and pharmacy in the Complete University Guide, and various other positions depending on what league tables that you look at. Now, I mentioned briefly there about members of staff within our school being research active. And the reason why that's important is, firstly, of course, you want to make sure that you're being taught the most up-to-date information that is available. And the only way that that's possible is if the people who are teaching you, your lecturers, are research active. But the second reason why that's important is because in your 3rd year, you have to complete a project that is novel, and that will be under the supervision of an academic member of staff. So as science students, that project will be laboratory based, and it could be in one of these general themes that we have in our school: cancer therapeutics, antimicrobial resistance, sometimes referred to as antibiotic resistance incorrectly, and medicines development and drug delivery. So different members of staff have different specialisms and different expertise and different interests that relate to these areas, and there may be a few other areas that sit slightly outside of this. And so the idea is that you will be given a title, or sorry, a list of titles, and you will rank those depending on which ones interest you most. And then there's a selection process that you go through and you get assigned a project. So just to give you one example of some of the research, I can really only talk with confidence about my own area, but I'll do that briefly. So an area that I'm interested in is how we get medicines into people safely, but also doing it in such a way that's good for the environment. And this uses a type of science that's referred to as sustainable or green chemistry. Some of you, particularly those of you coming through the A-level system, will maybe have learned a little bit about the principles of green chemistry. I take those principles and use them in a slightly different way. And what I'm interested in particularly is being able to extract chemicals called phospholipids from seaweed. We live on a big island. We're absolutely surrounded by seaweed. So let's see if we can use that as a sustainable source of material to make these tiny, 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 tiny little bubbles, if you like, called liposomes that can be used to deliver drugs into places that are traditionally quite difficult to get drugs into effectively. So that's one of the type of projects that you might get involved in as a student at Ulster. There are many others. Just to give you an example of one of the other ones, another string to my bow is I do some work in what is elaborately called astropharmacy. And this is really just looking at how we can improve the stability of drugs in space. Because one of the problems is space is full of radiation. Radiation destroys drugs. It accelerates their breakdown, so they have a shorter shelf life. So I have been looking at some of the strategies that can be used to improve the stability of drugs in space, and that is using a combination of laboratory work. You always have to have some lab work, but increasingly using computer modeling and artificial intelligence, because I'm not going into space to conduct these experiments. So what we do is we create a simulation of it in our high performance computing network and use that to model the reactions that are happening in space and see if there's ways that we can help improve the shelf life of medicines in space. So how will you be taught on the program? Well, increasingly we're aware that lectures have their place, of course they do, but increasingly we want to be able to work with students in slightly smaller groups. And that's one of the things which is a benefit of the MSci, that it is, generally speaking, a smallish number of students. By that I mean, less than 50. And what that means then is you get much more individual attention from lecturers and our technicians and various other members of staff who will support you at your time at Ulster. And that could be during laboratory work, it could be in small group tutorials, or it could be just in interactions in maybe member staff's office or in the corridor if you have a question to ask. All of these different ways which you will gain those valuable skills and knowledge and all of the other things that we associate with a degree. One of the ways that we support our students is by assigning all students a member of academic staff as their studies advisor. That's somebody that you can go to and ask any of those questions that relate specifically to your course of study. So maybe, for example, you didn't do so well on a class test or an exam and you want to know what the procedure is if you have to resit something. We also have a student buddy system, which is where some of our more senior students, so in second, third year, look after our first year students and help show them where to go to get a lab coat from stores or how to access services in the university. And it's a lot more informal having another student do that than a member of staff. We also, of course, have all of the academic staff that will support you, but then across the university, we have a very, very good wellbeing team, and the wellbeing team will support you in a whole variety of ways. I think very often people think of wellbeing in terms of maybe counselling and those kind of forms of support, but actually wellbeing team also includes academic support. So if you needed some help with some numeracy, some math, or if you needed help maybe improving your English, there are people within the wellbeing team that can signpost you to services to support that. Now, of course, one of the big things that we have in all universities, but of course Ulster is no exception, is the Students' Union. And one of the things that I think sometimes people always think about the Students' Union is that it's just kind of a bar or somewhere to go in the evenings, or there might be something on every now and again that you'd be interested in going to. The Student Union actually is a lot more than that. The Students' Union is a body that represents students and students' interests. And sometimes when there are problems that arise, it's the Students' Union who get involved to help try and find a solution to that problem. So as students of the university, you're all automatically members of the Students' Union, and you have the option to run for a Student Union office. That could be something like related to a sports club or a society. It could be a class rep. It could be a faculty rep, or perhaps in later years, you could end up being the Student Union president. So all of these are options for any student of the university. And excuse me, the work of the Students' Union is pretty important. They will always interact with members of staff. Our deputy head of school, Deborah Lowry, is the person who generally always will interact with the Students' Union on initially, and then the queries and problems or whatever they might be will then filter out to whatever members of staff that are required to get a solution. Now, over the years, we have gathered statements from various students who have graduated from the MSci, and I think it's always useful and interesting actually to think a little bit about what other students have said, successful students. We have two represented here. There are many, many others. Jessica was from a number of years ago, and Jessica was an international student who came from Canada. And of course, coming from Canada, she did not have the typical A levels or leaving cert type qualifications, but she found it very, very easy to fit in to our first year curriculum and did incredibly well, and ended up working for, ultimately after graduation, working for Almac in Craigavon. Owen was a homegrown student, so he did A levels here in Northern Ireland. And after the MSci, he also ended up getting a job, a full-time job in Almac. So an awful lot of our students do end up, at least for a period of time, going into the pharma industry, and then perhaps after that diversifying a little bit and maybe going into other areas. Because remember, just because you work in a science-based industry doesn't mean you always have to be in the lab. You could end up perhaps going down a sales and marketing route, or perhaps even a management route instead. So it doesn't necessarily mean you'll always be stuck to the bench. So in terms of admissions information, I said at the very outset that for this program, we regard chemistry as an essential subject. And that could be A-level chemistry, it could be Leaving Cert chemistry, or some other version of chemistry. And it is important that you do think very carefully about what you are currently studying, if you're still at school, and how that will fit into this type of program. If you think it is a good fit, then you can find a little bit more information about it on the UCAS website if you're hoping to apply that way. The information required for it is there. Or, of course, you can look at the university website itself. If you just go to Google and type in Pharmaceutical Bioscience, Ulster University, then the first hit you get will be this web page, and you can see down the left-hand side that you can look at the modules and entry conditions and so on. There's a video there which shows you some activity happening in one of our undergraduate teaching labs, and all the information that you will need about the program you will be able to find there. So the main thing I think to take away from this is that if you're interested in, we'll say, pharmacy, pharmaceutical sciences, anything of that nature, and that you are currently studying either A-level or Leaving Cert or something that contains a reasonable amount of chemistry in it, then the MSci program is definitely worth considering. So that is the end of what I'm going to be saying this evening. All the information that you need, you'll find on our website. The recording for this session will also be made available to all who have registered for this evening. And now we just have an opportunity, if anybody has any questions they would like to ask, you can do so. You can either unmute and ask them, or you can put them into the text window and we'll do our best to answer. So otherwise, apart from that, thank you very much for taking the time to come along this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at some point in your admissions journey.